Much like my video on the tribal class, this will cover the development and design of the battle class of destroyers, another fighting class of destroyers that was built for the Royal Navy. In the same vein, I'll be drawing from Dr. Clark's wonderful book, Tribals, Battles, and Darings, The Genesis of the Modern Destroyer, along with some other books like Norman Friedman's British Destroyers from Earliest Days to the Second World War. With the order of the tribal class in 1935, the desire for a successor to this fighting class of destroyer was almost immediate, especially by Admiral Sir Reginald Henderson, while he was Third Sea Lord and Controller of the Navy. He would start a campaign to make the J class of destroyers the successors to the Tribals, but unfortunately for Henderson, his successor, Rear Admiral Bruce Fraser, made a successful push for their armament to be more conventional. In the time between these more conventional destroyer designs, it was hoped that the light cruisers being built and already existing ones could fill in the gap between the smaller, more torpedo-focused destroyers and the more gun-focused destroyers like the Tribals. But quickly into the Second World War, as my videos on HMS Cossack have shown, there was a need for more gun-focused destroyers in the fleet. In September of 1941, designs that Admiral Henderson had been proposing in the 1936 and 1937 programs were granted support by the Admiralty with a certain amount of unprecedented speed. This was because of several factors, one being the World War going on and the need for more vessels, and the fact that the design had been around for some time now. As the ships began to take shape during the Second World War, there would be some decisions made that would drastically alter the design of the class, one of the most distinct features being the turret layout in the 1942/43 group of battles. The focus would be on the forward two turrets because of the aft turrets were not needed in combat, so the Royal Navy thought. In the Norwegian campaign and in the Mediterranean, the tribals used their rear turrets in engagements. According to Dr. Clark, it was, quote, a misreading of what was said in the files, or rather the context of what was said, end quote. Another important taxing factor was the complication in producing these turrets, being one of the most complicated components of the ship. By reducing the requirement from 4 turrets like the Tribals or 3 of other classes, this extra displacement could be used for more torpedoes and light anti-aircraft weapons. Not to mention, it would allow the class to be brought into service quicker because it would be easier to produce as compared to other classes. There was some apprehension about giving the ship fewer gun turrets. Some evidence of this can be seen in the 1943 batch of battle-class destroyers, with the replacement of the 4-inch star shell mounting behind the funnel with a 4.5-inch multi-purpose gun, and by the development of the Daring class, the ships were equipped with 3 turrets, including one in the Y position, which would be at the rear of the ship. Nevertheless, the 1942 battle class would only have 2 turrets in the front of the ship. Now, even when in a war, the Royal Navy could not do totally without testing, choosing to modify an S-class destroyer of the 5th Emergency Flotilla and create a testbed for the ideas of a new fighting destroyer. The ship would come to be HMS Savage, and she would have some modifications done to her. Notably, her stern was modified to give more space on the upper deck and to give some improvements to speed and endurance. She would also be equipped with a new 4.5-inch gun and twin turrets mounted forward, but would also carry 2 single mountings aft. To get her into service quicker, the twin mountings came from modified spares from HMS Illustrious, the first of the armored hangared aircraft carriers. Savage, like I mentioned, would serve as a testbed, but also was built to fight in the Second World War, and would do so, spending most of her service escorting Arctic convoys and participating in the Battle of the North Cape as well. Despite her experimental nature, she proved to be a capable ship, giving the subsequent battle class more merit and thus allowing them to be built. Moving on to the design of the battle class, I would like to use Dr. Clark's words to describe the design because I find them to be incredibly descriptive. To give context to the quote I'm using, Dr. Clark is describing the operational concept behind the battle class and how they are oriented to fighting with their guns. He writes, quote, while the tribal class could be said to have been built as cruisers to destroyer lines, the battle class would be cruisers forward of the bridge structure, but destroyers aft, end quote. These destroyers would have global operations in mind, like that of the Tribals, but to a larger extent. However, an even bigger change was the lack of space due to the presence of an extensive anti-aircraft battery, which is why every weapon aboard these ships, except the torpedoes, would be at least dual purpose. This was to compensate for the realized threat of air power against naval vessels. The design of which I will be describing is the 1942 class, having a full load displacement of 3,361 tons. They would be equipped with 2 boilers which powered 2 steam turbines that drove 2 shafts, giving the ships a top speed of around 34 knots. As I mentioned, the ship would be equipped with 2 twin quick-firing 4.5-inch guns forward. Now, these ships would be equipped with the Bofors 40mm anti-aircraft gun and Haselmeier mounts, instead of the Pom-Pom Vickers 40mm anti-aircraft guns, originally carrying 4, with 1 pair occupying the X positions towards the stern, and the other pair arranged in the superstructure between the torpedo launchers. Now, this was a pretty big change and something that I can't really do justice. I recommend you doing your own research on this subject because it's really an interesting topic. But just know this specific Bofors design came from the Netherlands to Britain by an escaping mine layer, which the original mounting came from an unbuilt German-inspired battlecruiser. Anyway, getting back on topic, there'd also be single mounts fitted to the ship, carrying between 12 and 14 in total. The ships would also carry two quadruple torpedo launchers slightly aft of amidships, along with carrying depth charges. Now, the first several ships would carry a lone 4-inch mount, but it was decided that it would be better to carry more Bofors guns, and later on removing that 4-inch gun. Now, it's important to note the improvements in radar and fire control directors found on the battle class, allowing for improved surface and anti-aircraft firepower. As for the ships of the 1942 batch, there would be HMS Camperdown, Armada, Trafalgar, Hague, Finisterre, St. Kitts, Cadiz, Gravelines, and St. James, along with several more. They would be laid down anywhere from 1942 to 1944 and commissioned anywhere from 1944 to 1946. Now, there would be later batches like the 1943 batch, which would be bigger and carry more firepower, notably another 4.5-inch quick-firing gun, along with Bofors and Stag mountings being another important change. And for the anti-submarine role, they would carry the Squid Mark I anti-submarine mortars. There would be other changes to these battles as well compared to the initial 1942 batch. Now, something I will briefly mention is the weapon class of destroyers, being built around the same time as the battles, albeit smaller and embodying that same general purpose spirit that the tribals and battles had. I hope to cover this class in more detail at a later date, but I figured I should at least mention it here. Another thing I should mention here is the fact that there would be some battles built for the Royal Australian Navy in 1944, which were different from the other battles as well. Some battles would see service long after the Second World War, with HMS Matapan of the 1943 batch serving well into the 1970s, being refit and modified to suit various roles that they would need to play in the Cold War, something that would happen to the other battles that served well into the Cold War. The battle class is a very fun design to look at, and I would highly recommend reading more about it in some of the books I will link down below, along with the British destroyer development as a whole. I hope to cover some of the service careers of these ships at a later date, but please remember to like and subscribe.